Okay, this is timeline. Okay, timeline. What is the first component you will interact with? Do you think? Login.
Yes, of course, the login will be the first.
A login form.
So the function is all about login. All about login. I give you the start. F1. The component one. Component one is the login page, right? So you will have this page like this. You go login. You request. Then login page. Receive your request and response this page. Response this page to the student. Then student can see the page. Then student can say, okay, I can input username, right? And also I can input the password. Okay, then second component, because the right part actually the system. So we now talking about the inner interaction of the system. So you may not know, so I give you the answer. Okay, the second one, we will request a controller. Controller is a component in your system. This controller has a name called a login controller. Okay, login controller. So request, we are going to the controller. Okay, going to the controller. Controller will receive username and password. Okay, will receive the username and the password. And when the controller already receives the username and the password, the controller will invoke the other component. This component you maybe know, because this component we already learned from the database class. Remember, there is a diagram called ER, right? ER what? ER diagram, right? Remember? What is E mean?
Entity relationship.
Entity.
Yes, entity.
Entity
So
relationship.
controller will invoke entity. Here is entity. Entity management. Okay, entity management. Like username and password, it will create a user entity. User entity. User entity. It will invoke a user entity. And while the entity actually stored, which part? Which component?
Component 3 or 4?
What is this?
Database.
Database. You are right. Database. Because this entity actually is language, right? Like Java entity. If you program in C#, then it is a C# entity. So it depends on the language you use. So this entity is not permanently stored. So when the user is like object here, you create a user, use the username, the password, it will go into what? Go into the database, right? To find the username and do what thing?
Authentication.
Make table.
First is to find the username. Second,
Password.
to query what column? First to query the username column, then second to query
Maybe the password.
Password.
Of course, password, right? Because you are going to log in, right?
Yeah.
Login actually is to check whether the username match what? Match the password, right? So here, the database will check whether the username matches the password. If it is matched, then it will return what? Okay, return okay. Then that means this user, you can find it in database. Understand? And it will going back to the login page, going to the login page. That means success, right? Success. Then it will going to jump, redirect, right? To main page. Okay. This is an example about the login function sequence diagram. You can see there are some components or subsystem involved in this sequence diagram. First is you should have the UI, the login page. Then you will have the server. First one is the controller. Controller is doing some function here. Then you see you will have the entity. Entity you already learned from the last class, last course. Database. You know the entity. Then the entity will mapping to database, because you should know that entity actually is object, because the programming language you used today, they are object oriented programming language, right? You know this OO? No,
Yes,
or don't know?
Oriented language.
Yes, of course, everyone knows, because the language is object oriented, but the database is not object oriented. It is what's this mean? Relational, right? Relational oriented. You should know database actually is RO. The language you use is OO, right? So between them, there is a mapping here. They can mapping your language object or language entities into the relational tables. Okay, any questions? Okay, because this sequence diagram, you are not required to finish in requirement documentation, but you should try to do this sequence diagram in design documentation. Okay, is that clear? Okay, then we go into the last part of requirement, from the previous three parts, we will do requirement analysis. That means we need to discover the analysis. Then we will find the requirement, and then we will write it down in different language. First is natural language, the other is structured language. We write it down into so-called specification. That means requirement specification. But as I said before, the requirement, you can never finish it. The requirements always incomplete, and the requirement may be changed during the development and during the maintenance, because the stakeholders, because